first time I met Commander Elia Zinthar of the Zitharan Collective, I was just trying to do my job. I wasn't expecting it to end with a diplomatic disaster and the most awkward moment of my life. But that's exactly what happened. It started when the Odyssey was sent to the Zitharan homeworld for a diplomatic mission. Our crew wasn't exactly the most experienced in the fine art of interstellar negotiations. Sure, we knew how to fix ships, handle repairs, and get in and out of trouble. But when it came to socializing with species that looked like they might eat you for breakfast, well, that was a different story entirely. Still, I had my assignment. Go down to the planet, check the environmental systems, and make sure the delegation's meeting space was safe and operational. Sounds easy, right? Except, of course, that things rarely go according to plan. I found myself wandering the Zitharan capital's towering structures, trying to find the room that had the malfunctioning oxygen recycler. I'd been told it was in the eastern wing, but nothing about this building made sense. The halls were like a labyrinth of sleek metal and glass, curved walls and strange, vibrant lighting. It was easy to get turned around, and easy to find yourself in a place where you didn't belong. That's when I found myself in a private Zitharan meeting chamber. No sign indicated it was off limits, probably my mistake, but I was too distracted by the flashing warning lights to notice. I stepped into what I assumed was a quiet hallway, and ended up face to face with the most powerful woman I'd ever seen. Commander Elia was like nothing I'd ever encountered. Her skin shimmered like liquid silver, her dark eyes glimmering with an intensity that made me feel like I was about to be crushed under the weight of her gaze. She stood tall, taller than any human woman I'd ever met, and her posture screamed authority. The way she carried herself demanded respect. And despite my panic, I felt that respect forming in the pit of my stomach. "Who are you?" she demanded in a voice that was both sharp and melodic. I froze, a deer caught in the headlights. I'm sorry, I was just... "Speak quickly, human," she snapped, her hand resting on the hilt of a sword sheathed at her side. I looked at the weapon and my heart dropped. There was no way I was getting out of this without consequences. "I'm just trying to fix the oxygen recycler," I stammered, trying to sound calm, but I could hear the panic creeping into my voice. "I think I'm lost." Alia's eyes scanned me up and down, assessing my worth in the blink of an eye. She didn't seem impressed by my greasy jumpsuit or my nervous demeanor. "You are in the wrong place. Leave now." I nodded vigorously, about to turn and bolt when my foot caught on a raised piece of the floor, sending me crashing forward. I tried to catch myself, but in doing so, I ended up, well, in a very awkward position. I collided directly into her chest, my lips brushing against hers in the most humiliating way possible. For a moment, time seemed to freeze. I could feel the coolness of her skin under my fingers, and I was suddenly hyper-aware of how close we were. The air between us seemed charged, as if the universe had decided this was the exact moment for fate to throw us together. But then her eyes went wide, shocked, angry, and confused. "You kissed me," she hissed, her voice vibrating with a mixture of disbelief and fury. I stumbled back, stumbling over my own feet. "It was an accident," I protested, feeling my face go beet red. "I didn't mean to..." Before I could say anything else, she grabbed my wrist, her grip like iron. Her voice dropped low, barely above a growl. "You do not understand what you have done, human." At that moment, I knew I had done something very, very wrong. And as her piercing gaze locked onto mine, I could tell that this wasn't just some trivial mistake. The moment my lips had brushed hers, something had changed. Something I didn't understand. Something I wasn't prepared for. She stood there for a long moment, her breathing shallow, as if trying to make sense of what had just occurred. And in that moment, I realized I had no idea what kind of mess I had just gotten myself into. I never expected an accidental kiss to set off an intergalactic crisis. But in that moment, as Commander Elia Zinthar held my wrist with a grip that could have crushed bone, I realized that I had just triggered something far beyond my understanding. Something that wasn't just about a diplomatic misunderstanding. It was about a cultural violation that I had no hope of fixing. "You kissed me," she repeated, her voice low and dangerous. Her eyes flickered with an intensity I couldn't quite read, and it made me feel even more out of my depth. This wasn't just a misunderstanding. This wasn't just a case of me being an awkward human. This was a life-altering mistake on a cosmic scale. I opened my mouth to try and explain, because surely she had to understand that I didn't mean it, that I wasn't some kind of interstellar pervert, but the words got stuck. What could I say? "Sorry, I didn't mean to accidentally kiss you in front of your entire honor guard and ruin everything." Her lips pressed together in a thin line, and for a moment I thought she might actually strangle me. Then, in a movement too fast for me to follow, she released my wrist and took a step back. Her eyes never left mine. "Do you have any idea what this means?" she asked, her voice sharp. It wasn't an accusation, but it might as well have been. The way she spoke made it clear that I had crossed some kind of sacred line, and that was the last thing I wanted to do. "Honestly, not a clue," I admitted, my voice trembling slightly. My entire body felt like it was on fire, and my thoughts scrambled for something, anything, that would explain how I had found myself in this situation. "You've just done something irreparable, human," she said, her words cutting through the tension like a blade. "You've bonded with me." "Bonded?" I echoed, blinking at her in confusion. I wasn't sure if I should laugh or cry, so I did neither, just stood there, trying to process. "What do you mean, bonded?" Aaliyah let out a sigh, her frustration palpable. "The Zytharans believe in a bond that transcends physical connection. It's a union between two souls, a deep, permanent connection that cannot be broken. And by kissing me, by touching me, you've forced this bond upon us." Wait, I said, shaking my head. "This is some sort of joke, right? A ritual, a custom?" I was desperate now, trying to make sense of the mess I had created. Her eyes softened, just barely, but the hardness never left her posture. "This is no joke. The bond is sacred. And now you and I are bound together, whether you wish it or not, for life." I stared at her, my mind spinning. The words didn't register at first. For life? The idea of being stuck with this intimidating, stunning alien woman for eternity seemed absurd. I barely even knew her. Hell, I didn't even know how to properly greet her people without tripping over my words or accidentally stepping on something sacred. "I didn't mean to," I said, my voice a bit weaker now, more pleading than I intended. "You didn't have a choice," she responded, almost pityingly. "Neither of us did. This bond cannot be undone. It is now our duty to each other." I was still struggling to understand what she meant. I didn't know anything about Zytharan culture or their customs. In the human world, a kiss might be a symbol of affection, or maybe just a mistake after too much to drink. But this? This was something else entirely. "You don't understand," she continued, her voice softer now, though the weight of her words still pressed heavily between us. "By Zytharan law, once a bond is formed, it is a lifetime commitment. It's not just a romantic connection, but a pledge of loyalty, of respect. A promise to fight alongside one another, protect one another, no matter what, even in the face of death." I gulped. This was too much. I was just a mechanic, a lowly human from Earth, not a diplomat or a warrior. I didn't even know how to wield a Zytharan weapon, let alone how to navigate the intricacies of their honor-based culture. Yet here I was, bound to the most powerful figure on the planet, forced into some kind of sacred partnership because of one slip of... I wanted to apologize again, but there didn't seem to be any point. It wouldn't change anything. The bond had been forged, and there was nothing I could do to break it. "So what now?" I asked quietly, unsure of what else to say. Aaliyah gave me a long, searching look. "Now we proceed as if nothing has changed," she said, her tone calm, though a flicker of something I couldn't place lingered in her eyes. "But know this, everything has changed." And with that, I realized how deeply my life had just shifted, like a ship dragged off course by a powerful, unseen force. There was no going back from this. We were connected. The days following the accidental kiss and the revelation of our bond felt like I was living in some strange alternate reality. I was still processing the fact that my simple mistake had escalated into a life-altering situation. It wasn't just awkward. Now it was inescapable. I had become bonded to Commander Alia Zinthar, the fierce, respected leader of the Zitharan Collective. And there was no walking away from that. At first, I tried to distance myself from the whole situation. After all, I wasn't equipped to deal with intergalactic bonds or Zitharian customs. I'd barely even managed to get through the first diplomatic greeting without tripping over my own words. Yet Alia seemed to be in no hurry to make things easier for me. If anything, her cold demeanor made it clear she didn't exactly want to deal with this bond either, but she was bound by her culture to accept it. Our first formal meeting after the bond was, to put it mildly, uncomfortable. I stood awkwardly in the chamber, trying to avoid her gaze as she addressed the others in her usual commanding tone. As the Zitharan fleet commander, Alia was revered, her every word carrying the weight of her authority. When she spoke, everyone listened, and no one dared to challenge her decisions. Yet here I was, a lowly human standing beside her, branded with a bond I never asked for. "Commander Zinthar," one of the high-ranking Zitharan officials said as he looked at her with respect, his eyes flicking toward me, "it is an honor to finally meet you and your companion." The word companion stung more than I wanted to admit. It wasn't as if I didn't want to be part of her life, but I wasn't exactly prepared for this level of responsibility or commitment, especially with someone who barely tolerated my presence. Alea's eyes flicked briefly to me, and I could have sworn I saw a flicker of something, maybe guilt? Or perhaps frustration? Before she masked it with her usual impassive expression. "Do not mistake this bond for anything more than what it is," Alia said coolly, her voice cutting through the tension in the room like a sharp blade. "I am bound to this human by the will of the universe, but that does not mean he is my equal, nor does it mean we are united in any emotional capacity." The word emotional stung even more. If anything, it reinforced the distance between us. She was trying to separate herself from the bond, treating it as a duty she had no choice but to fulfill. A bond forced by law, not by choice. I understood that, but the words hurt nonetheless. I nodded, trying to keep my composure, though my insides twisted. I wasn't exactly sure what I had expected, but hearing her try to dismiss the bond, our bond, so easily made me feel small. It felt like she was trying to distance herself from me, and I wasn't sure if it was because of the bond itself or because she was simply trying to maintain the professional distance she needed to lead her people. When the meeting ended, we returned to her quarters, the silence between us thick and suffocating. I didn't know what to say. I wanted to ask her if there was any way out of this, if there was any possibility of returning to the lives we had before. But I knew that wasn't how things worked in Zitharan culture. The bond was permanent. There was no undoing it. The laws of her people didn't allow for renegotiation or escape. Alia's posture was rigid as she moved around her quarters, organizing data pads and preparing for the next diplomatic session. It struck me how comfortable she seemed in her role, even with me there, even with this unspoken tension between us. "You don't have to keep treating me like I'm a mistake," I said, my voice softer than I intended, as I finally broke the silence. Alia didn't look up from her task. "It is not that simple, human," she replied, her tone clipped, though it lacked its usual sharpness. "The bond is sacred to my people. To dismiss it, to treat it as anything other than a responsibility, would be dishonorable." "I get that," I said quickly. "I understand that this is a big deal for you, but it's a big deal for me too. I didn't ask for this, but here we are." There was a long pause before she turned to face me. Her eyes softened just a little, and for the first time, I thought I saw a flicker of something like uncertainty? "This bond does not make us equals," she said quietly, her voice surprisingly gentle. "But it does not make you less than me either. We will learn to navigate it. Together. It is inevitable." I didn't know what to make of her words. There was still so much distance between us, so much unspoken tension. But in that moment, I realized that this was the beginning of something I couldn't control. Whether we liked it or not, we were bound to each other, for better or for worse. And somehow, we'd have to find a way to make it work. The silence stretched between us again, but it wasn't as suffocating this time. A small flicker of hope sparked inside me, though I wasn't sure what to do with it. Whatever happened next, I knew one thing for sure. My life would never be the same. The bonding ritual was one of the most bizarre and intimidating things I had ever experienced. I thought I had prepared myself mentally for the strange customs of the Cytherian people, but nothing could have fully prepared me for what I was about to endure. I had learned the basics. The bond, once established, could only be deepened through a ceremonial rite. The kiss, which had started this whole mess, was merely the beginning. The ritual was meant to solidify the bond, an act that would transform us into a permanent, inseparable pair, not just in spirit, but in duty. The day of the ceremony arrived, and I found myself standing in a grand Zytheran temple, flanked by towering stone pillars, each etched with alien symbols I could barely comprehend. The air was thick with the smell of incense, and the low hum of a melodic chant filled the space. The room was enormous, and yet it felt suffocating, the weight of tradition pressing down on me. Aleya stood beside me, regal as always, dressed in ceremonial armor that shimmered with an otherworldly glow. Her presence was as commanding as ever, but today something was different. She was tense, her face a mask of stoicism, though her eyes flickered occasionally toward me, filled with an emotion I couldn't place. The Zytheran priests, their robes flowing like liquid metal, moved around us in a slow, synchronized dance, chanting in a language I couldn't understand. A heavy silence followed their movements, and the space seemed to vibrate with an ancient power. I felt a knot form in my stomach. My heart raced, and my palms were slick with sweat. Aleya's eyes met mine, and for the first time since this entire fiasco began, I saw something akin to vulnerability in them, maybe even hesitation. The high priest stepped forward, his voice booming as he spoke in Zytheran. The crowd, if you could call it that, murmured in response, their voices rising in unison, a choir of voices thick with ritual and reverence. I tried to focus on what was happening around me, but my mind kept circling back to the one thing I didn't want to think about, the bond. This was the moment that would cement my place in this world, for better or worse. Aleya turned to face me, her posture stiff, but her eyes softer than I'd ever seen them. "This is our duty, human," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Do not mistake this for something it is not." I nodded, though I didn't fully understand what she meant. What was I supposed to feel right now? Was this supposed to be a solemn duty or something more? I had no answers. I had no idea what I was getting myself into. All I knew was that this ceremony wasn't just about a kiss anymore. It was about a lifetime commitment, a binding promise that would change everything. The high priest raised his hands toward the sky, and the room fell into an eerie silence. The air around us seemed to shimmer as if charged with static electricity. I could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on my chest, the sense that my entire future, Elena's future, hung in the balance. He gestured for us to kneel, and we obeyed, moving in unison, our knees meeting the cold stone floor with a quiet thud. The ceremony's final act was a simple yet deeply symbolic gesture, a shared vow. The words were ancient, and they seemed to echo through the chamber, vibrating in my very bones. The high priest spoke first, his voice steady and filled with authority. He recited the sacred oath, the words binding us together in ways I couldn't begin to comprehend. I didn't understand the language, but the weight of the vow settled over me like a thick blanket. I was in this now, whether I liked it or not. When it was our turn to speak, Alea's voice was clear, but there was an edge to it, something taut, as though she were holding back. "In life, in death, in battle, we are one," she recited, her eyes locked onto mine. There was a moment of quiet between us, a fleeting hesitation before I managed to speak the words I had been instructed to repeat. "In life, in death, in battle, we are one." The moment I spoke those words, something shifted. It wasn't physical, but I felt it, a weight, a pressure in the air, a feeling that I was now tied to her, not just by this strange cosmic law, but by something deeper, something unspoken. I had no idea if she felt it too, but it was undeniable. We were connected now, our fates intertwined. There was no turning back. As the ceremony concluded, the room erupted in a chorus of approval. The priests chanted in unison, and the Zithran officials nodded in satisfaction. But all I could focus on was Alia, her gaze now softer, more contemplative, yet still distant. I had no idea what she was thinking, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we were both trapped in something neither of us had asked for. The bond was real. It was unbreakable. And we would have to figure out how to live with it, together, for the rest of our lives. But as I stood there, trying to catch my breath, a strange thought crossed my mind. Maybe, just maybe, this wasn't the end of my story with Elia. Maybe it was only the beginning. The days after the ceremony passed in a blur of confusion and discomfort. Everything felt different, and yet nothing had really changed. The bond between Elia and I was now undeniable. It was like a constant hum in the back of my mind, a presence I couldn't escape, no matter how hard I tried. We spent the following week in near silence, a strained calm hanging between us. She was always distant, her eyes sharp and unreadable. She didn't act like we were bonded at all, as if the whole thing had been nothing but a bureaucratic formality. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted, that the world as I knew it had been irrevocably altered. Every time I looked at her, I felt the weight of that bond, unseen, unspoken, yet omnipresent. Alia, as always, focused on her duties. She was a commander, a leader, and that was where her attention stayed. But I noticed that there were times when her gaze lingered on me, as if she were trying to figure out what this bond meant for both of us. I caught her looking at me in the hallways, during meals, even in the quiet moments before bed, and each time I tried to avoid it, pretending I hadn't noticed. But the truth was that I couldn't escape her presence anymore, not even when I closed my eyes. I had expected that I would somehow become part of her world, but it wasn't happening the way I imagined. She was still the fierce, intimidating figure she had been before the bond, and I was still just the awkward, out-of-place human she had reluctantly accepted into her life. The bond didn't seem to make us equals. It made me feel like a constant reminder of her burden. One afternoon, I found myself standing alone on the observation deck of the Zithran flagship, staring out at the vast expanse of space. The stars were so far away, distant pinpricks of light against an infinite black canvas. I tried to clear my mind, but all I could think about was Alia. Where did I fit in her world? What role did this bond play in the bigger picture of our lives? I had no answers. But then, without warning, I felt her presence behind me. Her footsteps were soft, almost imperceptible, but I knew she was there. I didn't turn around. I didn't need to. "I thought you would be here," she said, her voice quiet but steady. It was the first time in days that she had addressed me without the coldness that had characterized our conversations since the ceremony. I didn't know how to respond, so I just nodded, still staring at the stars. Just needed some time to think. She didn't say anything at first, and for a moment I wondered if she would just leave me to my solitude. But instead, she stepped closer, her presence almost palpable now. "I've been thinking too," she said, her tone softer than I had ever heard it, "about the bond, about us." I finally turned to face her. Her eyes, which usually seemed impenetrable, were open now, vulnerable in a way I hadn't seen before. She wasn't the same commanding officer who ruled her fleet with cold precision. In this moment, she was just a woman struggling with the same uncertainty I felt. "I know you didn't ask for this," she continued, her voice low, "and I didn't ask for it either, but it's here now, and we have to figure out how to live with it." "I don't even know where to begin," I admitted, my words stumbling out before I could stop them. "This whole thing, this bond, it's like I'm not even myself anymore. I feel like I'm just attached to you, and I don't even know why or how." Aaliyah's eyes softened further, and for the first time I saw a flicker of understanding in them. "I know," she said quietly. "I feel the same way. But we're not alone in this. We're in this together, and maybe that's the hardest part to accept." I wanted to say something in response, but the words caught in my throat. How could I explain to her that I wasn't ready for this, that I wasn't ready to be bonded to someone, especially not her? But I didn't want to be cruel, and I didn't want to hurt her. "To what now?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady, though the uncertainty bubbled beneath the surface. She took a deep breath, as if she were gathering her thoughts. "Now, we live," she said simply. "We take this one day at a time. We don't have to understand everything at once, but we will find our way." The words didn't make the situation any less complicated, but they did offer a small sense of comfort. There was no grand plan, no perfect solution. We had to work through this together, whether we wanted to or not. For the first time in a long while, I felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe, just maybe, we could make this work. Maybe, despite everything, this bond wasn't as much of a curse as it had seemed at first. But as the silence stretched between us, I knew that it would take more than hope to make it work. It would take time, patience, and a whole lot of understanding. Things neither of us were particularly good at. But for now, we had each other, and that was a start. Time moved forward, though it seemed like we were both stuck in a kind of limbo. The bond was always there, a presence neither of us could ignore, but our interactions remained carefully measured, awkward, as if we were walking around each other in a delicate dance neither of us knew the steps to. Aaliyah continued her duties as commander with her usual precision, always in control, always unshakable. Her leadership over the Zytheran fleet was unmatched, and everyone in the ship followed her orders without question. But there was something different now, something beneath the surface that I could sense but couldn't name. Every time she spoke to me, her tone was more guarded, her eyes more distant. It was as if she was keeping herself locked away, as if she didn't know how to approach me or didn't want to. The ship was a vast, cold place. I wandered through its halls often, trying to make sense of my new life. There were moments when I thought I saw glimpses of the woman beneath the commander, the vulnerability I had sensed when we first spoke after the ceremony. But those moments were fleeting, vanishing before I could hold on to them. And when I tried to reach out, to ask her about the bond or how we were supposed to navigate this strange partnership, she would retreat into her shell, closing herself off like a fortress. I didn't understand her, maybe I never would, but the more time I spent with her, however indirect or brief those moments were, the more I realized I was beginning to care about her. It wasn't just the bond, although it was undeniably a part of it. No, it was something deeper, something more complicated. There was a fire in Aaliyah that drew me in, a quiet strength that kept me coming back, even though I wasn't sure what role I played in her life. One evening, as I sat in the mess hall, eating my meal alone, I noticed her across the room. She was talking with a group of high-ranking officers, her posture confident, her voice steady as she issued orders and made decisions with ease. Yet there was something off about her, something I couldn't quite place. A slight edge to her tone, a tension in her shoulders that seemed out of character for the usually composed commander. I couldn't help it. I watched her for a moment, my heart racing. It wasn't the first time I had observed her from afar, but this time felt different. Something inside me stirred, an uncomfortable feeling I hadn't anticipated. It was almost like I could sense her unease, even if she was doing her best to mask it. When the meeting broke up and the officers dispersed, Aaliyah walked toward the door, her eyes catching mine for a brief second before she quickly turned away. I watched her retreat, and without thinking, I stood up and followed her. The hallways were quieter now, the hum of the ship's engines the only sound as I made my way through the corridors in pursuit of her. I found her standing by one of the observation windows, her back to me. She was looking out at the stars, her hands clasped behind her back. There was a subtle tension in her posture, like she was bracing herself for something. "Aaliyah," I said, my voice soft but enough to make her turn around. She didn't immediately speak, but I could see the way her jaw clenched, the way her eyes flickered with something unreadable. I wasn't sure if she wanted to talk or if she would brush me off, but I took a step closer anyway. "I don't know what you want from me," I admitted, my words coming out before I could stop them. "I don't know what this bond means, what it means for us. But I need to understand. I need you to help me understand." Alia's expression was unreadable, but there was a flicker of something behind her eyes. Uncertainty, maybe fear, I couldn't tell. She took a deep breath before answering. "I am not the person you think I am, human. I am not someone you can just bond with and expect to walk beside in harmony. My world is built on duty, on responsibility. I cannot simply turn that off." "I don't expect you to," I replied, my voice firm despite the knot in my stomach. "But I'm not here to take that from you. I want to understand. I want to know who you are, Aaliyah. Not just the commander, the person behind all that." She didn't answer right away. The silence between us stretched on for what felt like an eternity. I waited, unsure of what I would hear next, if anything. But eventually, Alea's gaze softened just a fraction, her shoulders relaxing. "I don't know how to show you who I am," she said quietly, her voice tinged with something I hadn't heard before: vulnerability. "I've spent my life pushing people away. It's easier that way. It keeps me safe." I could hear the pain in her voice, the admission she had never let anyone see before. I felt a deep ache in my chest, not just for her, but for myself, too. This was all so new, so overwhelming. But I wasn't ready to give up on her, not yet. "You don't have to do this alone," I said, my voice steady despite the emotions swirling inside me. "Whatever this is, whatever we are, we'll figure it out. Together." For the first time since we'd been bonded, I saw something like relief in her eyes. It was brief, but it was there. And in that moment, I realized that maybe, just maybe, this bond wasn't about just duty or obligation. Maybe it was about something more, a chance to build something new, to find each other in the chaos of it all. And for the first time, I felt like I wasn't just lost in the vastness of space. Maybe, with her by my side, I could find my way. The weeks that followed felt like an endless cycle of uncertain steps. Aaliyah and I continued to navigate the strange bond that tethered us, each day bringing new challenges and moments of awkward silence. Yet something had shifted between us after our conversation by the observation window. There was a tentative understanding now, a fragile thread of connection that held us together, even if we didn't fully understand what it meant. Aaliyah became more open, though only slightly. She didn't push me away like she had in the past, but there were still times when she retreated into herself, pulling away from me when I thought we were starting to make progress. I respected her space, not wanting to force her into anything she wasn't ready for, but I couldn't deny the moments when the bond felt overwhelming, when I couldn't help but feel her emotions, her doubt, her fear, pressing in on me. It was on a late-night shift, as I walked the dimly lit corridors of the ship, that I encountered Aaliyah again. She was standing near one of the observation windows, her gaze fixed on the endless stretch of stars outside. The soft hum of the ship's engines was the only sound, and I could feel the familiar tension in the air. She wasn't aware of me at first, her mind seemingly lost in thought. I hesitated, wondering if I should approach or leave her in peace. But something pulled me forward, something I couldn't explain. Slowly, I stepped closer, my footsteps quiet but deliberate. "Alia?" I called softly, almost uncertain of how she would respond. She didn't jump or flinch as I half expected her to. Instead, she turned slowly, her eyes meeting mine, and for a moment we just stood there, wordless. Her gaze was softer now, but there was still a layer of something beneath the surface, something that kept her distant, guarded. "I didn't expect you to be here," she said, her voice low but steady. "I couldn't sleep," I replied honestly, unsure if that was the full truth. In reality, I just couldn't shake the feeling that something important was unfolding between us, and I needed to be near her to understand it. Alia nodded, her lips pressing into a thin line. She seemed about to say something, but then stopped herself, her brow furrowing in thought. After a long moment, she sighed and stepped aside, gesturing for me to join her by the window. "Sometimes, the stars are the only thing that makes sense," she said quietly, her voice carrying a weight I hadn't heard before. "I've spent my life looking at them, wondering if there's more out there, wondering if—" She trailed off, and I sensed she was struggling with something. The same vulnerability I had glimpsed before was there, just beneath the surface. This time, I didn't push her to speak more. Instead, I simply stood beside her, allowing the quiet to settle between us, feeling the pull of the bond even more strongly now. We stood together for what felt like hours, just watching the stars. There was no pressure, no need for words. It was as if, in this shared silence, we were both finding comfort in each other's presence, without the weight of the expectations we had placed on ourselves. Finally, Alia broke the silence again. Her voice was barely a whisper, but the sincerity in her words was undeniable. Maybe this bond isn't as much of a curse as I thought," she admitted, her tone softer than I had ever heard it. "Maybe it's not just about duty or responsibility. Maybe it's about finding someone, to hold on to in this vast, chaotic universe." I felt my heart skip a beat, the weight of her words settling over me like a warm blanket. For so long I had felt like I was drifting in space, like I didn't belong anywhere. But standing here with her, hearing her say those words, I realized that maybe, just maybe, I had found my place, not just as a human bonded to a Zitharan commander, but as someone who— "I'm not sure what this will look like, Alia," I said, my voice steady though my heart was pounding. "But I want to try. I want to see where this bond can take us." Alia looked at me then, really looked at me, her eyes searching mine as though she were trying to read my soul. And in that moment, I could see the flicker of something, hope perhaps, or the beginning of trust. It wasn't much, but it was enough to let me know that maybe, just maybe, we were on the path to something more. She nodded slowly, a small, hesitant smile tugging at the corner of her lips. "I think I'm willing to try too." It was a start, a small one, but it was enough to make the uncertainty feel a little less daunting. Together, we were beginning to find our way. As we stood there, side by side, staring out at the stars, I couldn't help but feel a quiet sense of peace wash over me. The bond was still there, unbreakable, undeniable, but now it felt like something we could share, something that could shape us both in ways we hadn't yet imagined. And for the first time since this all began, I felt a spark of hope. We might not have all the answers, but we had each other. And that, in this vast, endless universe, was enough.